C'est bien, bien. Oui.
I think I can start. We can start? Okay.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the second section of our program. I'll just do a brief introduction of the three studies that we will be looking at in this section. The study on alternative and innovative funding mechanisms for ACP cultural industries. That will be presented by Dr. Keith Nurse, followed by the study on the economic and social impact of 6 ACP festivals. That will be presented by Ms. Catherine Burusi, followed by the study on the challenges and the economic and artistic impact of online dissemination and distribution of ACP cultural content. That will be presented by Mr. Destiny Chewali. Okay, in preparation for this meeting and looking at the studies, I would like to say that there were really 6 aspects that came out, and as we hear the presentations, I'd like to encourage you to pay attention to this orientation and see what you can help to do in terms of adding to the discourse and widening the scope of the debate. The first thing that came up when I was looking at the different studies here is what is the perception of the cultural sector at this point? Do we see it, or do you think the states are looking at it as a viable economic actor in terms of diversification out of traditional export activities, or do you think it's just being looked at as an enclave? We heard some points which led us to the latter perspective, but we'd like to hear more in terms of the awareness of the states at this point. Secondly, what are the success stories? We heard in the evaluation that there are many. But when you look at the presentations, there are 2 different levels of analysis. The first one is in terms of the cultural operator. How are they being encouraged to develop their product in terms of what training have they been receiving? How have they been able to further refine their product? What guidance are they getting in terms of access to market? How advanced or what progress has been made in terms of the protection of intellectual property rights? And also, how is the information, the access to information and knowledge, how is that being shared? We heard about the intra-ACP dynamic. Is there an increase in the sharing of knowledge? Then you go to the other aspect, which is the marketing aspect. Once we have refined the product that the cultural operators have to offer, how is this now approached from a commercial aspect? The circulation, the distribution. We also heard about the absence or need for growth in terms of market regulation. So then it comes to the whole issue of access to networks, building upon networks already attained. How is the new technology in terms of innovation? How is that being used to either increase competition or to make it even easier to break into markets? And most importantly, what type of access to finance and investment comes out of this intervention? So whether it's a trade fair, whether it's development of different cultural products, how is access to finance helping them to become cultural entrepreneurs? So there was a key question: what is the long-term market-oriented business facilitation that comes out of these interventions? So if we have that at the back of our mind, I think at the end of the discourse we will have some very good points as we project to the future. Another thing which came out of these studies is how is the cultural sector now, after the benefits that have been reported from Cultures Plus, how is it at the national level being perceived? Does it still stay as a silo, or are governments, are our regional operators, whether it's a regional bank or the NAOs or private sector, are they seeing it having interlinkages? We heard the intervention from Ghana and other representatives today, which said that they literally had to go to governments to try to make the case to get support for cultural festivals. Is that the case? Is culture seen as a route to other sectors? Culture boosting up tourism, boosting up manufacturing, a reason to even focus more on the IT progress? Is it seen in terms of youth entrepreneurship, startups? Is culture being seen as a vehicle to poverty eradication, or is culture just remaining at the project level? So the challenge, when you look at the different programs here, are we jumping from the project stage to the program? And if we are doing that, what is the role of government? What is the role of the private sector? More specifically, in terms of government, the NAOs and the RAOs, how are they engaging with the other ministries? And what is the role of the development banks? If you're talking about commercialization, who better than to become involved than the development banks? So we'll be listening very, very keenly, especially not just in relation to the first study on alternative funding, but what happens after you have a cultural festival? What are the spin-offs? And this links very nicely in terms of the discourse that we had this morning. The fourth issue now, when we come into the whole commercialization of culture as a poverty reduction initiative, where does the export capabilities, where is that leading to? Where is the trade support? Where is the financing support? Where is the business support? Does the digital age, does it help or does it hinder in terms of having competition for imports? Are we breaking the edge of becoming a net exporter, or are we somewhat at the brink of doing it but not exactly doing it and remaining as net importers? Towards the end, another theme which I saw coming out too is that, yes, you have a long list of sources of finance, but are we really tapping into it? So we will hear the types of finance that are available, whether it's for trade fairs or business missions or market development, access to credit. Is the government really having the feelers on to provide attractive tax breaks or tax exemptions, productive business missions, or are the entertainment taxes conducive or preventative? There's a lot that you have to look at in terms of seeing the cultural sector as a vehicle to be commercialized and as an answer to one of the key problems that we have and challenges that we have as developing countries, trying to break away from our traditional exports and expanding. So it requires a larger dialogue, and this is what the research that we have, what we'll be getting feedback from. This is what they will be leading us to in terms of how can we now project based on the lessons learned so that we can catapult from the project success to a wider program success and having different actors to the table. So the intra-ACP component, of course, we'll always have to learn from the successes, whether it's in East Africa, Kenya, or Southern Africa, Botswana to a certain extent, or South Africa, West Africa, of course, Nigeria, and look at the specificities as well of the small island developing states. You have the cultural exports, the religious artifacts that have been very prominent, say, in the Pacific region. You have the music industry, which is growing in the Caribbean. How can the challenges be assisted from the perspective of government, private sector, and development bank? So you will see from all of the presentations that all of these questions come up, and we have to try to see what we can actually learn from the empirical data that will be presented. So after this brief overview, I'd like to first ask Dr. Nurse to provide us information on the study on alternative and innovative funding mechanisms for ACP culture industries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. It's a pleasure to be here at ACP Secretariat. I'd like to thank the organizers for facilitating my participation and the preparation of the work that was involved. I will get quickly to it. I was asked to look at alternative and innovative funding mechanisms for ACP cultural industries. Throughout my presentation, I use the term cultural and creative industries interchangeably, and so please excuse me. I think the presentation is going to be provided on screen in French, so I will speak in English. So I hope you will be able to follow in the presentation. When we look at the objectives of this study, there were some key points. The first is to identify the different types of alternative and innovative funding mechanisms in operation in ACP countries, to identify indirect public support mechanisms, to identify innovative and alternative public funding initiatives, and analyze the type of private support mechanisms, to identify case studies and best practices, and to put forward conclusions and recommendations. The bulk of this research is done in terms of desk research. We also employed utilization of a survey which was sent to all of the ACP missions. We did get some responses from Niger, Togo, Angola, Madagascar, Benin, Gabon, Dominican Republic, and the OECS territories. So you can see that we didn't get a wide spread of contribution in that regard. We've also been interviewing key experts from around the ACP region, and we've had some moderate success with that. So there is a severe limitation in terms of the data availability that we are faced with. In many respects, the creative and cultural sector is largely unmapped and undocumented in most countries, and especially when you start talking about issues of financing. By and large, it's not documented in any significant way in any of the countries in the ACP sector. So the rationale, as Natalie indicated, it's to identify ways in which ACP countries can break out of the traditional commodity export activities, particularly to move into areas relating to the services sector and intellectual property, and to also tap into the economic partnership agreement. The other key thing is that there is a strong cross-fertilization between the creative sector and other sectors, particularly tourism, manufacturing, ICTs, and so on. And so that is a key concern. For the report and study, we have identified some of the trade data, and of all the ACP countries, only 4 countries are net exporters of creative goods. We don't have the data on creative services or creative intellectual property to be able to make that determination. But if you use creative goods as a proxy, it's only South Africa, Nigeria, Dominican Republic, and Cuba that are net exporters. All the other ACP countries are net importers of creative goods. This is important to appreciate because the export capacity of these economies ultimately provides an indication as to the investment capacity, meaning the absorptive capacity of these countries to attract investment in the first instance. So let me proceed. The first area that we looked at was the incentive and policy measures. Again, it's very difficult to identify what are the existing policies on the ground, because in most countries it's actually not well documented. But what we are seeing is that there's a wide array of both fiscal and tax incentive measures being applied to varying degrees in different countries and different regions. Most of the incentive measures are focused on fiscal measures as well as trade and border measures, and we have a listing in the below. What can be said about them, about these incentives and measures, is that by and large they tend to be passive. And what we mean by that from a trade standpoint is that these incentives are offered by the government, but there is no necessarily any policy to encourage participation. Secondly, there's very little monitoring of the participation in these incentives measures. So in most countries, they can't identify to you how many firms are taking advantage of the opportunities. And so this approach to advancing the creative industries probably won't generate much significant growth. In fact, it hasn't generally, and for good reason in some instances. Many private operators in the creative sector try to avoid the tax man, as they say, and so registering their businesses and being involved in the governmental sphere in terms of tapping into fiscal incentives and even tapping into trade border measures are something that they are not necessarily interested in doing. And in the next slide, what I talk about are some of the areas where governments in the ACP regions can be more proactive in terms of allocating resources for both what we call market development and industrial stroke innovation programs. These approaches tend to be more effective in terms of winning markets for the creative sector, but they require more proactive and interventionist policies and measures, meaning that the government and other non-governmental agencies have to be more focused on creating opportunities for the sector, which would include things like trade missions, export grants, trade fairs, and strategic business-to-business support, strategic partnerships, and the list goes on. There are several market development programs that can be employed. And this focuses on creating the demand for the genres of work or the specificities of the artist's productions in a particular country. On the other side, the industrial and innovation programs are focused on generating the supply, improving the human resource capabilities as well as the capacities in terms of institutions, running things like incubators and clusters, accelerators, and financing startups. So those are some of the areas that we are finding to be more proactive and positive. In the next slide, we talk about the issue of the role of banking institutions. In the area of the commercial banks, the general experience has been that this is a limited source of financing for the creative sector, often because it's viewed as expensive source of credit. Many times, the loans that you can get from the commercial banks are at consumer rates, and they also tend to be inflexible for creative firms, meaning that it has high collateral requirements, monthly repayment installments, and often there's no recognition of the intellectual property as a form of capital. So in the diagram here, it was some work that I did a few years ago in the Caribbean, where we evaluated access to credit for various entrepreneurs, creative entrepreneurs in Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago. And by and large, the bulk of their financing comes from their own resources, or family, or friends. The next key area of investment comes from reinvestment, meaning the profits from their operations. Loans is a third key source of financing, followed by grants, and lastly, new investors. What this is suggesting, which we suspect is applicable in most developing countries, and definitely in the ACP region, is that strengthening the commercial viability of cultural operators or entrepreneurs is the most effective mechanism of financing the sector. Of course, in fact, one can argue that, and in terms of my research, I don't think there's any sector where I've ever done research where the operators or the firms say that access to credit is easy, or they don't have a problem accessing credit. Every sector says that accessing credit is a problem, but in the creative sector, it is made even more problematic in terms of the ways in which creative firms operate, particularly small firms. They often don't have proper record keeping. They don't have an understanding of how to prepare a business plan or a strategic plan or a feasibility study. Often they are artists who become entrepreneurs. And so their training is not in these areas that we are referring to. So unless we begin to change those set of capabilities, making them finance ready, access to traditional sources of credit would continue to be a problem. There's a critical role to transform this, and so I'll give some examples as we proceed. In this slide, what I illustrate is that there's an important and increasing role for development banks that provide both concessionary loans as well as provide loan guarantees. We're also seeing that export and import banks are offering what we call collateralization of contracts and also collateralization of rebates. This is, in many respects, still only at the embryonic stage. And there's some examples of case studies from across the ACP region, and so I list them on the right-hand side in terms of the case studies. So the Cultural Industries Guarantee Fund, which is offered through the ECOWAS Investment and Development Bank, was cited by several of the respondents to the survey from the ACP countries as a best practice. And on the face of it, from our analysis, this is something that probably bears an opportunity for replication. The other key example was from Nigeria, the Creative and Entertainment Industry Stimulation Loan Scheme, the Culture Bank in Cape Verde, and so on. The Exim Bank from Trinidad and Tobago provides collateral financing in music, film, and fashion, and what they're able to do is offer up to 80% of the value of a contract for financing. In the next slide, we were asked to look at the role of private investors and corporate sponsors. By and large, corporate sponsors would fund a particular activity or festival, but its capacity as a source of income generation or source of financing is very limited. Next slide. What we are seeing expanding those areas for venture capital and angel investing, but again, these are largely at the embryonic stage, and so we have identified a number of case studies of examples of how this is growing. There's also growth of microcredit and financing, mostly funded by international donors and targeted at poverty reduction schemes. In the next slide, we looked at the issue of mixed funding models, and this is where there's public-private opportunities for growth. In many instances, we find that this also is attracting international donor financing. We give the example here of the direct assistance grant scheme offered through the Caribbean Export Development Agency, and they funded multiple areas of the creative sector, but only 5% of their direct assistance fund is going to the creative sector. And someone was asking me earlier about it, and I was arguing that creative firms are competing with firms from other sectors, in agro-processing, in manufacturing, in tourism for these funds. And so unless the creative firms are in their capacity to make proposals are improved, their access to these funds will probably not increase. Next slide. Crowdfunding was an area where we were asked to look at specifically. Africa is the region with the greatest strides in crowdfunding. The Ton Fund in South Africa, Mchanga in Kenya, and StartCrunch in Nigeria were key examples of that. The funding there is not large. It's not going to be transformative at the current level of funding. We see in other countries like Suriname and in South Pacific, there are some crowdfunding opportunities that are emerging, but again, they're pretty small in terms of their impact. So we get now to the challenges and key recommendations. In most countries, only one or two types of alternative innovative financing frameworks are available. Most financial institutions do not have a suitable framework for creative firms, including in some of the regional development banks, although this is improving. The return on investment from the creative firms tends to be low, with a few exceptions, which is what is highlighting the perception of high risk. And so access to finance, it is a critical challenge, but it is not a standalone issue. So some of the key recommendations are that we need to facilitate alternative financial instruments like loan guarantee schemes, collateralization of rebates, and so on, to attract sustainable investments through donor funds, potentially. But one of the key recommendations is that just providing finance is not going to make the difference. You need to be financing in multiple areas and providing access to market. So startup funding, cluster funding, equity and debt financing, as well as export financing is what is required. We need to strengthen the marketability and profitability of the firms through incubators, as well as through facilitating business coaching. And lastly, improve access to finance should be twinned with market entry and market access programs. In the last slide, I have a diagram which shows that we need to be thinking not in silos or not in a projectized way. It has to be a programmatic approach where we're thinking with the market entry programs as the start and working our way back towards things like accelerators, incubators, clusters, and startup programs. In this regard, there's a role for various agencies. Startup funding and clusters and incubators can be facilitated through regional and industry associations. Regional development banks can play a role in terms of financing, debt and equity financing. And lastly, export financing can be facilitated through export promoting agencies, which are to be found in most countries and regions. And I'll end on that note, and thank you for your kind attention.
Right, thank you, Keith, for these very interesting presentations and the recommendations that you make. We will jump to the next presentation, so I kindly ask you to take note of any questions you may have, because we will do them all at the end. The next presentation will be done by Catherine Boresi for the impact of festivals. Catherine has been working in the media and film industry for more than 20 years. She's the former Deputy Director of the European Film Market for the Berlinale and former Director of the European Audiovisual Entrepreneurs. So Catherine, whenever you are ready, please.
Thank you, Annika. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Oui, donc j'oubliais, je vais parler.
Good morning to one and all. I'll speak in French, and the slides will be presented in English. The aim of the study it's almost finished, in fact, was to conduct an analysis of the artistic, economic, and social impacts of a few ACP festivals, to measure their effects on the circulation and marketing of works, on the promotion of cultural diversity, and on the local social and economic development attributable to these events. There were 6 analytical criteria on the impact. The first one was social and societal of the festival. Second one, cultural and artistic. Third, marketing circulation of works. Then economic, professional, and financial stability. It's a study which began in March, which is ending now. And there were 5 experts commissioned to carry out this study. And of course, we share the same methodological tools. Well, the festivals investigated, I'm not going to go through the entire list. I think you know them more or less. Just a minor remark. There are 3 festivals here which have been in existence for the past 20 years, even 30 years. MAZA, FESPAC, and the Durban International Film Festival. And we have 3 other festivals, Africa Fed Festival in private sector, Ilcourt in Mauritius, which is on short documentaries, and the Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival. 3 festivals were supported by the ACPCultures Programme, Africa Fed, Ilcourt, and Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival. But in the latter case, it's not the festival itself which was supported by the program. The program supported the new activities, markets, the urban film mart, and the data bank for Caribbean films. Just a mention about our relationship with the festivals, their capacity to give the data we needed varied. And it was clear to all the experts that the festivals supported by ACPCultures Plus program were in a better position to give us the data we needed, because I imagine they had to give a structured data in order to access funding, but also because it is part of their work structure. So there was no problem in their furnishing statistics, which were necessary. The first criterion, as I said, refer to the social and societal impacts, how the festival facilitate access to culture for the greatest number of people, but also for minorities. The first conclusion is the festivals create social links, a sense of belonging, which goes beyond the public or the audience attending the festival. For example, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Abidjan, we spoke to taxi drivers, and they knew that the Massa was taking place, not because it boosted their economic activity, but for them, it's something which was part and parcel of the life of the country. Massa had to be interrupted during the Ivorian crisis, and now it has come back, and it is very important in the national cultural life. Sometimes the sense of belonging goes beyond the national borders. What was striking in Trinidad and Tobago, in Port of Spain, was that many participants said that they were not only Trinidadians but West Indians. Now, festivals seek out their public, they move to their public decentralization processes in order to cover the largest number of people. Another conclusion that festivals are not just one-off, so to speak, events. They are present throughout the year. Through films being shown, training courses, but in most cases, except in Massa only has a budget for the year in which the event takes place, so it can't go beyond that year, but all the festivals are active throughout the year. Another striking fact, which is general in nature, is women are present at all levels. Whether you're talking about the management, the teams, the programs. In other words, even if you don't have a section given over to women's creations, but you had creative women in all sectors, and particularly where these sectors have the most impact, catering, hotel and restaurant, and this was borne out by what happened in Solomon Islands Pacific Arts Festival. Of the 6 festivals we studied, 3, as I repeat, were managed by women. There was a co-management for Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival, the Massa and Ilcourt Festival. Minorities are represented through the use of their languages, the Creole in Mauritius for Ilko, and many artists singing in various languages and dialogues for the Africa Festival. Cultural and artistic impact, promotion of cultural diversity. Festivals facilitate meetings between the artists, their works, and their public. In other words, it's not just a matter of exhibiting the works, but organize encounters with the public. That closeness means that the festivals also act as artistic education centers, which is very important for the development of future generations of artists. And you have an example of Ilko, which has become a small school for cinema in Mauritius. Let me just gloss over certain other issues. In the workshop this afternoon, you can have more examples. Now, festivals are regular. They can give artists support which is lasting. They are a source of sustainable support, and they work for the promotion and recognition of cultural diversity of the ACP works and artists. This morning, we spoke about the South-North dimension, and the Durban Festival, for example, is a platform for launching works which will move from the south to the north. Economic impact, the first point is that festivals buy or rent all the works they present. So there's a difference between the festival, some festivals which pay artists a fee, and cinema festivals which pay a right of representation. But here we see that the festivals are the first to market the works to a certain extent. This is particularly important for young artists selected for the first time. In most cases, it's the first time they will get income from their practices. All the festivals studied are building marketing channels, distribution channels. The example of Trinidad and Tobago, the main sponsor is a telecom network which has a VOD platform, and all the films selected in the festival can be downloaded on the platform, and 100% of the income from the online sale of these films goes to the artists. Obviously, once an artist is selected in a festival, he is selected in other festivals. It's an incentive for widespread dissemination, and festivals organize a networking of artists and professionals, and this is the primary reason given by the participants to justify their presence. Just on the economic consequences, festivals are direct job creators, but you have to make a distinction between public status and private status. In general, you have civil servants who work, when you're talking about festivals, financed by the public sector. There are significant local economic benefits in the areas of hotels, catering, handicraft, and services. What I mean is communication services, photography, web design, and festivals contribute to the improvement of infrastructure and the professionalization of local technical industries. As regards the festivals I would study, we didn't really see considerable impact on tourism, but this is something they want to focus more on. Let me go directly to financial conditions and stability. Well, obviously, the festivals depend on financing from the public sector, and in most cases is international funding which is dominant. If you look at the festivals from the private sector, Maza, Festpac, and Durban funding comes essentially from the public sector, but in the other festivals, international funding is dominant. There is very little financing coming from municipalities, but whereas it's the municipalities which benefit the most from the economic impact of the festivals. There are varying sponsors and partnerships, 0% to 75%. So sponsors are in the majority in funding. There's no use of crowdfunding, alternative financing. In general, what we can say is that the festival teams lack capacity in seeking out new funding, because we are dealing with extremely small teams and they don't always work all the time, all the year.
Directement. Donc sur la base de ces...
On the basis of all these analyses, the first recommendation is recognition of festivals as cultural objects on their own. You saw in the slides this morning that festival is not recognized as an important cultural operator. What we have shown with this study is that festivals are not only areas where works are exhibited over 3 to 10 days, they have really become distributors, training centers. So they need to be recognized as playing their own role. Now, there's no consultation of donors. We see that international festival is always the same donors. So if we can pool all the international and national donors and invite representatives of the municipalities, local government, maybe we will manage to have a better coordination and give an incentive to other potential donors, because there is an economic impact from festivals. One more thing on the structure of festivals is supporting professionalization. This is not well developed. You are dealing with very, very small teams, committed teams, and they have to be helped to be better structured. As regards the content, it would be very important for all festivals to put in place public identification tools. It's very important to determine exactly what you're doing. It's also important in approaching sponsors, because if you know what the public consists of and how many people you want to cover, obviously it's easy to convince a sponsor. You need a continued presence throughout the year, because this really consolidates festivals in the public's minds, and it means that we have more and more spectators. Let me give you a figure. Il Cours in Mauritius began in 2006 with 200 spectators. The 2015 event had 12,711 spectators, and 2016 seems to have confirmed this increase. Okay, I just need to wind up. One of the recommendations refers to the organization of training and educational workshops. Hence the importance of young people in the public and networking. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing these very interesting results, which indeed will give us a lot of elements for the discussions in the workshop. So we come to the last, but not the least, presentation on the study on the challenges and impact of online distribution of cultural content. The expert is Destiny Chiewali, who is an expert consultant and a researcher on digital policies and strategies at the Center for Studies on Integration and Globalization in Montreal, Canada. If you can stick to 15 minutes, that would be great. Thank you.
tous. Alors, l'étude que je vais vous présenter.
The study I'm going to present is placed in a context of the digital revolution, which has been with us for just over a decade, and it is affecting the cultural industry sector. So we are seeing an exponential increase in the volume of cultural goods. These are being transited digitally, and we also see a growth of electronic commerce in cultural goods and services. It affects all modes of production, distribution, and consumption of cultural products. And at the same time, we see a real upheaval of the cultural value chain, a change in the business models that will change as compared to what we've known up to now, and also a change in the monetization process of these cultural goods. So today we can see a clear need to learn more, get some data which would allow us to understand how this is being circulated. Up to now, we've been using indicators on the rate of penetration and on infrastructures, but we don't know much about how it is used and the content. So this study raises a lot, well, looks at a certain issue, a certain number of issues, objectives of the study. We would analyze the existing monetization process for the diffusion and online distribution of ACP cultural products, and also look at the economic and artistic impact on areas of music, literature, design, fashion, fine arts, photography, and audiovisual. The second objective is to identify the strengths and weaknesses and challenges of this type of diffusion and distribution of cultural goods, and also analyze the economic and artistic benefits for professionals in ACP culture. And finally, conduct a mapping of the existing supply of ACP portals and platforms were initiated by ACP-based actors on non-ACP portals, international portals, which show ACP products. So this takes me to the main issues of the study. The first is the economic benefits, but we looked at which business models work in the ACP countries. Then we were also looking at the characteristics of the ACP cultural goods by highlighting the strategy of the people who disseminate these cultural goods, how they use the new media to have a wider targeted audience. And finally, what general lessons can we learn from dissemination portals mapping? And we also looked at the visibility of ACP works on international portals like Netflix, Spotify, MusicMe, Ubox, and how this visibility can be improved. We know that very often we wonder whether these platforms are an advantage or a disadvantage for the diffusion and profitability of ACP cultural producers. So the issue of monetization and distribution in the areas covered by the study are looked at. And then we look at the legal and financial challenges in terms of copyright, intellectual property, etc. Now, by way of methodology, we've used a qualitative and quantitative type of methodology, but we looked more at qualitative data. we started by looking at all the documentation on cultural policies as well as digital policies, national policies regarding digital technology. And then we try to see how these two types of policies, sectoral governmental policies, match. Then we sent questionnaires to operators. We sent 2 electronic questionnaires to collect the perceptions of stakeholders and achieve the mapping of portals. We wanted to see how exactly they dealt with this new type of technology. And the challenges, we had oral interviews, informal meetings with and we took part in a lot of workshops on these areas. Now, limits and constraints. It was a very ambitious study, but there were some difficulties in accurately characterizing what the ACP is culturally offering online. Then, uneven availability of data across these sectors and countries as regards digital technology. And then another limit is the relatively small size of the survey population. Now we move on to the main results that came out of the study. Now there are a few salient facts, and I would stick to the more important ones. The first one is a low availability and visibility of ACP cultural goods online. It's drowned in a standardized type of international offer of programs, and the ACP have a lot of problem in getting to the forefront, because the international platforms give preference to the star system and this type of mainstream type of cultural production. That's the first important thing. And the second main result relates to the obstacles before they go online. What happens? And the first answer for that, it's because there's a lack of infrastructure and electricity networks and connectivity. Well, you know, there's a big digital divide in ACP countries, and the development of digital technology varies greatly from one country to another. Then we lack vision and strategy regarding digital cultural technology. When we looked at cultural policies, we saw that there was a lot of things missing, like the taking account of the digital side. So because of that, the policies focus more on creation and production without taking account of this of the marketing side, particularly marketing digitally. Then there's a lack of competence of the ACP creators before online distribution. You need to be able to master the instruments which would allow you to go online. We talked about legal supply. You know, there's a lot of piracy in ACP countries. And then the poor quality of the content of ACP goods. Well, they say the ACP are not professional enough to meet the international standards of cultural distribution. We also see an imbalance between ACP supply and what is supplied internationally. And regarding the factors which determine the economic benefits, well, first of all, we see the professionalization of the sectors. And then the quality of what they produce online, and this relates to the capacity of the actors. Well, the capacity to go online and also their capacity to properly manage their business and be able to reach a wider public with the ACP production. We also talk about the most profitable monetization strategies. Very often people they favor music, cinema, audiovisual, books and fashion because they generate income online. Regarding strategies, we need to diversify supply because if there is a lot of supply doesn't mean the supply is diversified. And what also comes out from the study is that we need to stress commercialization of works and direct economic benefits. And finally, and this was mentioned earlier by other colleagues, the contribution of content providers and network operators to finance the creators. Now, these network operators see the value, but they do not finance it upstream, and that affects cultural artistry. Finally, the issue of publicity and marketing, because nowadays it's data which is the black gold regarding digital technology, and sometimes people refuse to share this information. They're quite selfish about it, and by holding on to that information, they always stay ahead. One important point came out is that international platforms, well, very often we see them as threats, but it could be something good for the sharing or distribution of ACP goods. Another important issue is that we need to sensitize ACP content consumers about the importance of intellectual property and copyright, particularly to ensure balance between creators and users. Regarding general trends in the areas most affected, we saw a few sectors: cinema, audiovisual, and cinema and books. There is a limited distribution of cinema and audiovisual, piracy, closure of theaters and physical locations. But with VOD and SVOD, we have an increase in the number of terrestrial TV channels, transition to DDT, increase in advertising, and increased download and streaming practices. Development of new genres and formats of content such as web series, as you see in Cameroon, which is very successful. As regards music, we have a domination of platforms, and there are about hundreds of legal platforms. But the problem for the ACP here is that the ACP artists are not yet familiarized with these new ways of new manners of distribution, and they still use physical types of support. Regarding books, well, we don't have any conclusive experiments on this, and few online sites selling physical and digital books. But there are some sporadic efforts to encourage virtual libraries, but that is for later. Now I'll try and go a bit faster and say that regarding the platform, we need to know that overall they don't get a lot of visitors. 58,000 to 100,000 visitors per month. And only 2/3 of all known platforms offer consulting catalogs or online sales. And the reason for that is that they have difficulties in online payment, because in ACP it's very difficult, particularly if you have to go through banks, because then you have to register and pay something. What is an advantageous economic model is freemium, combination of free access and paid access to exclusive premium content. Now, to conclude, we have 3 types of recommendations. The first one is to public authorities and ACP states. You need to accompany and support the digital transition of ACP cultural industries. You know, to turn risks into opportunities, put in place infrastructures to look at, to deal with the digital divide. And we need to promote and protect the diversity of ACP cultural expressions, because it's being threatened, particularly with these trade agreements, which do not make a difference between digital products and other services. We have to look at the quality and quantity so that we can highlight what the ACP is producing. Of course, it's up to the states to support training programs so that they could increase the know-how of those people involved in the cultural, digital cultural sector. Strengthen and protect copyright, because our policymakers need to pay people for what they produce. And those we have to respect this whole issue of neutrality and strengthen international cooperation and this issue. And then we have to come up with indicators. Now, for the artists, we would like them to participate in training programs and strengthening distribution skills marketing. They need to innovate in the use of technology and digital tools in the field of artistic creation, and they need to raise the awareness of the public regarding to the importance of copyright and enforcement of intellectual property rights. And then what is also important is to build multi-stakeholder partnerships. So we are encouraging consultation with the civil society, private actors, in order to maximize the presence and promotion of works in ACP cultural content in digital environment. And to donors, well, they need to support ACP states in adaptation project for renewal of their cultural policy. We need to strengthen collaboration between international organizations, because up to now there's been a lot of work being done in isolation by UNESCO, OIF, ITU, and the ACP Secretariat. We need to balance out cultural exchanges between developing countries and developed countries. We need to help finance innovative and inclusive projects. Well, it's not only for digital platforms. Everyone is now creating a digital platform, but the added value is what you put in the platform. So you should contribute to the content, like like in Nigeria, there's something similar to Netflix, but they produce things locally, so we need to continue with that. And finally, we need to list or create a directory of best practices which everyone can get ideas from. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Destiny, for this very comprehensive presentation. I think the message is quite clear to us that ACP cultural content has not really been able to make profit or take advantage of the new opportunities that this evolution has given. We will now open the floor for comments and questions. We have about 15 minutes at our disposal, so I would ask that you limit yourselves to 2 minutes per person. Maybe we take 10 minutes of comments, questions, and leave 5 minutes for the experts to respond. So who would like to start, please? Yes.
Sorry. Good afternoon. My name is Amal Mohammed. I'm from Hiva Fund from Kenya. I just wanted to maybe answer what Dr. Natalie had asked, what the perceptions of the cultural sector are to banks and to government. Firstly, to banks, it's all they perceive the cultural sector as very risky, mainly because there's not much data. And as the speakers today have also mentioned, that is quite a challenge we have. And then another thing with governments, first with government follows success and good PR and policy lobbying. And as we heard earlier in the morning, sometimes culture can be good, sometimes culture can be bad, especially when it's connected to a political area where the government falls under. For example, in Kenya, we have the Film and Classifications Board that is really trying to restrict a lot of Kenyan content, and what we did, we came together and we had one voice. When artists come together and have a voice to lobby their policy, that's really powerful, and that's the way that we can approach governments. And then banks follow proof of concept. When they see us as risky, it's for us to show and take responsibility. And as Dr. Nas spoke, he basically echoed a lot of what our feasibility studies have shown. One thing I wanted to say is that for what we have done in the absence of public finance, we have had to find pseudo commercial models to fill in that gap. I had a question for Dr. Nas because he mentioned development banks. When we talk to development banks, especially like, for example, the Africa Development Bank, which is also in their office in Nairobi, one challenge that they have is that their tickets are very, very large. So when the kind of money that they would be providing is things that would be for infrastructural projects that the government can deal with, for example, building venues or textile factories. And then another thing is that their focus is production for export. For example, if it's fabrics, then mass export abroad, not really for local consumption. And then also, banks in their very nature, they are commercial, they're looking at interest rates, and as you mentioned, what we need is patient capital. The challenges are not just financing, but also capacity building. There are very many trainings and capacity building that can be done other than just financing. So there needs to be a body that looks at all of these challenges as a whole, and that's what we're trying to do, although in a small way. Thanks.
Thank you. The lady next to you, please.
Thank you. My name is Ayeta Ann Wangusa from Tanzania. My question builds on the issue of data and what my sister from Ghana said. The role of there's the need to support government to collect this data because, for example, in Tanzania, there is a national development plan that has been launched. But if you look at the sector that talks about the creative economy, there is no data that talks about projections for the next 5 years. And yet we are talking about a creative economy. Thank you.
Thank you for this remark. At the end.
Juste une information rapide.
Just rapid information. I'm Dominique Grigo, Director for Africa of Cinema Next. It's the largest installer of cinemas in Africa. We have many cinemas being developed in Africa, and we hope this year to be partner of FESPACO.
Oriol?
Bonjour.
Gentleman here first.
Je voulais seulement.
My name is Oriol Flesh Matalonga from UNESCO office here in Brussels. I just wanted to add to what Destiny Chowali said, particularly as regards to recommendations. We obviously know it's important to defend the promotion and protection of cultural diversity and cultural works. In December, from the 12th to the 15th of December, the Intergovernmental Committee on the 2005 Convention on the Protection of Cultural Expression will be meeting, and major work has been done by all the state parties to the convention, the 28 EU countries and most of the ACP countries. They will be studying and working on the operational directives relating to the digital environment. So I'm saying to the EU and the ACP that in such a forum, there should be as much representation as possible. We couldn't speak with a strong voice from the ACP and the EU in order to have a coordinated work. I'm talking about UNESCO, OIF, ACP, and EU. We are in the same boat. So I think this needs a reminding. And in particular, the ACP and the EU can support this work towards protecting cultural expression and the 2005 convention. Thank you.
Well, thank you for reminding us of the need to work all together. Shall we take one more comment before we let the experts respond? And then, of course, we will have more opportunity to exchange in the workshops. So the lady at the end.
Bonjour, je suis.
Good morning. My name is Claire Gadea, co-producer of Run, the film Run. I'd like to thank previous speakers who congratulated us on Run's success. I'm also co-producer of the film Jambolatry with Stephen Markowitz. It's on South Africa. I just wanted to share our experience with you on Run, particularly from the point of view of the 3 studies. I think there's something very important we take now on board. We are dealing with production companies in Europe or in the ACP countries, and we are dealing with small structures with not many human resources. And when you come with a film, all of a sudden we have to manage a large team, a large number of people. There are many people we have to work with, and the increase in staff or in the number of people is difficult to manage. Particularly when at the start there were not many of us, for example, in getting funding for the film, etc. As regards is seeking out funding, today we have a genuine partnership with the Côte d'Ivoire Culture Ministry. It's true, this support was extremely important, and there was a genuine political backing for the film. There is a political will to breathe new life into the cinema industry in Côte d'Ivoire. So putting in a proper system in other countries is necessary. Despite the work we did with the Ministry of Culture and all the individual work we did, we needed to seek out 15 sources of financing. We didn't have the human resources to seek out private funding or sponsors. We met people, we met various partners, and today you have to think about how the product can be placed properly, and the possibility of having people or groups, intermediaries, middlemen who would help us to find the necessary private financing. A first point. And the second point refers to working with banks. As regards cash flow, it's something which is difficult to manage because we need a lot of cash. There are technicians, there are actors who don't have bank accounts and they have to be paid in cash. So when you are making a film in Côte d'Ivoire, Abidjan, or in Burkina Faso, in areas waiting for a bank to give us money, we have to stop filming, and we can't afford to stop filming. So there is a disconnect between our work rate during a filming and the work rate of a bank. It's something which is being addressed by the Ministry of Culture in partnership with a bank which would like to participated in cash flow. I'm not talking about crowdfunding. It's something which is lengthy, which requires a lot of agreements being signed, and the process didn't reach to the end, and we didn't benefit from it. So you have to think about financial partners and banks and how they can be committed to a project far enough upstream. Once you find the money, we sometimes end up with a budget which is finite 2 or 3.
Our interpreters really need a break, so I will just let the man on the right have a word, because unfortunately he has to leave us. We will continue, but if the interpretation stops, we will just have to manage because they really need their break, and we will have plenty of opportunity to exchange during the workshops.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Bonjour.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I am one of the initiators of Africa TV, which was the first platform of VOD in the same year as Iroko. Thank you for the conclusions. I think a point is missing, however, which is important. I am happy to hear that UNESCO will defend the report. The main hindrance relating to online money-making enterprises in Africa refers to the level of income. 95% is very small. Mass, with the exception of South Africa, where things are different, and Nigeria as well. But for the other countries, there's a factor of 2 to 3 in Africa. It's the most expensive in the world. So we, in the operators, have to engage in agreements with the producers, which makes it possible for us to offer the consumers $5 to $10 per month that they can pay in, but the consumers are ready to pay it every month. But when you look at the share of telephone costs, telecommunication costs in a household in Africa, is reasonable. So if they pay €5 or €10 in order to have unlimited access to Netflix, the streaming of a single episode will cost the same as for an entire year. So it's not profitable. It's very complicated. There is the issue of telephone communication in Africa, which is primarily in the hands of companies from the north. So there are questions arising here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's go then to the experts. 1 minute each for conclusions and responding to the comments.
Great, thank you very much. The point made by the representative from HEVA Fund is a very valid one. What we are finding with the development banks is that They are now interested in participating in these sectors. 5 years ago, they weren't interested at all. So we have to find a mechanism by which they can participate, and they can do so by providing access to some of these concessionary financing through commercial banks. So the commercial banks do the on-lending because they are more familiar with dealing with small projects, with individual operators. And you're quite right. The challenge is that for development banks to participate, we have to show what is the export-oriented capacity of these sectors. So unless we begin amassing the data that shows the contribution of these sectors, it's very difficult to make the argument that this is something that's worthy of investment. Yes, you are also correct. We do need patient capital, but capital tends to be not patient. It wants to know what is the return on the investment. And so unless we are able to articulate how this return on investment can be generated, it's unlikely to happen. So what do we do? There are firms that are generating return on investment. We just have to be able to have that information more readily available. And so that's why in the proposal I'm talking about creating access to business coaches who can help firms in the creative sector both structure their operations better, but also report on their operations so we know whether or not they're generating the kinds of income. I'll just make one last comment. Generally there is the data that we've collected in terms of the trade performance of most of the ACP countries indicates that they are all net importers, with a few exceptions which I mentioned earlier. This is really a telling factor. How do we boost that export-oriented capacity? Tends to be a critical factor because domestic markets at home tend to be too small. And so export orientation is a critical feature of boosting even access to finance or going into online distribution systems. I'll end my comments there, and maybe we'll pick it up more of these issues in the workshop. Thank you very much.
Petit commentaire par rapport à...
Just a minor comment relating to what Enrico Chiesa said. Yes, there is a primary obstacle here, and I said so in terms of the analysis of the obstacles and policies. Today's issue of connectivity, access, and the cost and the fee that has to be paid. We know that with statistics of the International Telecommunications Union, the least developed countries, the African countries, and some island countries in the Pacific have the highest rates of access to streaming. And we know that this is what circulates content. Maybe it didn't turn out clearly, my recommendations, but for some, it's a primary obstacle. And here we speak about infrastructure, and we advocate that policies be implemented to make access to the internet fairer and open to everyone. It would include the need to propose maybe low-cost tariffs for access to internet. So it's taken on board, and maybe we can re-emphasize it in order for that message to be relayed. Thank you.
Okay, in interest of time, I'll just make a very, very brief summary, and I think the discussion so far has been very rich because it shows that we have to have different dialogues. We have to have dialogues at the national level to address issues such as how do we share best practices, how do we train in a much more professional way, have business coaches, how do we ensure that we fine-tune what has already been successfully achieved. At the regional level, we have to make sure that the commercialization approach is more in tune with the expectations of the operators. So that means we have to have more dialogue with the development banks. We have to, I like the term, use patient capital versus interest rates focus. We have to fine tune it so that the operators are given a chance to actually thrive. And at the international level, we have to see how we can relate with our international partners, UNESCO, Francophonie, ACP and the EC, to ensure that we have a strategy that not just focuses on export to market access, but as well see how we can listen to what the operators are saying and ensure that at the strategic points we make the effective lobbying and the case for service exports to be highlighted. So there's a lot of fodder for us to think over for the workshops. So I think at this stage we can reflect and see, especially bearing in mind the different film references, or whether it's basic things such as connectivity. There's a lot of potential for the digital route, but if you have basic problems such as access to connectivity and regulations, then how do we surpass that? So the NAOs have to be more involved, the operators have to be speaking to the NAOs, the banks have to be a part of the dialogue, and of course the international partners have to be around the table. So with this perspective, we can start the afternoon session at 2:30. We thank the interpreters for their patience, and we look forward to a continuation of this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathalie. Can I just say something about this afternoon? Je voudrais dire juste un mot et requiert toute...
Yes, your attention, please, for this afternoon.
Workshop festival. It's in room A, downstairs. Workshop financing in room B, also downstairs, in front of the cafeteria. And the third workshop, distribution and new technologies, will be here in room C. Donc je répète en français, les ateliers, c'est
Let me repeat in French.
salle A, à côté de la cafétéria. Financement, salle B. Et distribution, diffusion, salle C ici. Juste une chose importante, l'atelier festival n'aura pas de traduction simultanée et sera principalement en français. So the third workshop festival there will be no translations, no simultaneous translation. So now we break for lunch. Thank you very much, and I'll see you later. Thank you.